it is absolutely possible for anyone to get sober, and I honestly believe that. I do think it takes a tremendous amount of energy that we're not used to putting in. So it feels different, and it feels terrifying. But with the right instruction, you know, and I do think that more than what I thought was possible is actually possible, and be honest with yourself. You know, there's an inner wisdom in all of us that goes untapped for a long time, which is where a lot of the answers lie. And it's in that honesty we find that inner wisdom, and we can tap into that in a way to really change things. I'm Chris Leston, and I recover loud.
Recover loud, let your voice ring clear. Together we stand, no more hiding in fear. With every success, our stories ignite. We celebrate life, we're ready to fight. Ready to fight. Oh, ready to fight. Let the world witness what we found. In recovery's light, we'll always be proud. Let the world witness what we found. In recovery's light, we'll always be proud.
Welcome to the show. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your story with us today.
Yeah,
What
thanks
was
for
it,
asking me to do this.
what was it like for you as a kid growing up?
I was really into art, and I think I not necessarily as a result of that, but I spent a lot of time alone. It seemed like, and kind of withdrew into myself. Um, I wasn't I wasn't a kid who played organized sports, or I didn't grow really up in a neighborhood. I kind of grew up on the outer skirts of town where there was more old farms and whatever in Walpole, Massachusetts. And so I spent a lot of time. I think art and music was kind of my first addiction, or kind of delved into escape. I was in band. I played the saxophone, and then in high school years, I was in a terribly awful sounding punk band as the singer. So, and
Wow. What brought you to using substances?
I don't know that there was ever really this thing that kind of launched me or catapulted my substance abuse. It was more of kind of the image I was looking to kind of fulfill with the artist. All my friends were musicians. My idols were, dead rock stars, to be quite honest with you. And it was kind of like earning my stripes, I guess, like my idea of a man.
Yeah.
Um, that kind of pursuit of, um, I guess, sex, drugs, and rock and roll type image, you know.
So you were emulating your idols.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was nothing, the first time I smoked weed, there was nothing social about it. A friend of mine, I asked him to get me a bag, and I went home and I smoked in my parents' backyard by myself, and then right off the rip, kind of continuously with a substance that a lot of people kind of consider to be harmless. It was every day right off of
Yeah.
that experience.
Yeah, I had a similar experience. Marijuana was my first,
Yeah.
and I used every day. Once I started, it was an everyday thing. Did you use any other substances?
Yeah, I kind of went down um the gauntlet, I guess you could say. I had a brief time with heroin and cocaine. Cocaine I didn't really care for. Not really the speedy kind of guy.
Yeah.
But when heroin kind of came across my path in my early 20s, and I had a friend that was pushing it pretty hard with that, and that's when I decided, like, kind of made this conscious decision. But I guess while I still had the ability to do that, I'm not going down this road because it was destroying him. And that's when alcohol really kind of shot through the roof after that. Um,
So, what would you say is your drug of choice?
Alcohol.
alcohol.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, primarily. But I'm one of those guys who will do anything that you put in front of them. I
Yeah.
just necessarily won't go out to get it. I couldn't necessarily make it past the liquor store if I had $20 in my pocket.
I actually quit drinking 5 years before I went to
Yeah.
rehab. And I've been lucky, I guess, to stay away from that because it is so prevalent in society.
I'm from Walpole, Massachusetts, so right next to Foxborough.
I couldn't find people that I fit in with.
Mm,
Growing up in Webster, there was all kinds of diversity,
yeah.
and there wasn't any up here. So, at what age did you decide to quit everything and get on the right path?
Again, another interesting question. It was a progression. I mean, it was kind of haunting me for years before I kind of got to this position of I really like the understanding like I'm not going to be able to use any kind of substance and get away with it. And that so I got sober at 30, but I think I started trying to kind of conduct my own experiments as far as like how can I get around actually giving everything up, probably around 26.
Yeah.
Things started to kind of unravel and I started noticing, I'm not a I dropped out of art school, and friends of mine were settling down in relationships and careers and making those moves and I'm watching people kind of surpass me in life,
Mm,
achieve things that hey, I never really gave much thought into creating in my life, but just the fact that I knew it was kind of unattainable for me started to really kind of scare me. And I remember, I think I was 28 when I wound up in the psych ward. I would say a decent effort at trying to stop. And, that's, I think, when I crossed the line into, okay, substances aren't giving me what I need them to give me anymore in order to cope with my life. At that point, it's kind of, I refer to it as kind of like being on the fence. Like I couldn't stay on one side too long. Being sober was miserable and
mm,
getting high or drinking was miserable. And I would just kind of flip flop back and forth. But there was a number of years there. It was just kind of agonizing. And I was still able to go to work. I was still able to kind of do
mhm.
that thing, which from the outskirts, I think family and friends knew that it was problematic, but I don't think that they necessarily knew exactly what was going on,
Mm,
and how consistent and the quantities. And, if they stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon, they were going to see something that was terrifying,
yeah.
didn't really know was happening.
Mm,
Yeah, I was kind of, I remember making amends to my employer that wound up having to terminate me, and I had been there off and on for 10 years. And, I started there when I was 19 I remember making amends to him and he basically says like, we didn't know you had a problem until you stopped
right.
showing up to work. Cause I was the guy that would show up and I might smell of booze,
Yeah.
from the night before, but I'd work the overtime. I'd show up early, I'd do all that stuff, but
You're basically, a functioning alcoholic.
for a while until I wasn't. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And that's how my life was. Um, I was functioning in everything I did. And towards the end, it was mostly, just drugs.
Mm,
And, I was functioning every day, doing all the things I needed to do, playing with my kids, going out and taking them to functions and stuff like that. But it wasn't until, you know, I guess I believe that nobody noticed, until I got to the point where I wasn't doing anything but using, you
mhm.
know, uh, nobody noticed. What did you do exactly to stay in recovery?
I tried, I think, a few different things. I didn't have much resources,
Mhm.
and this is the worst year, I think, was 2005 when, I had two psych ward stays. I had been terminated from the job. I'd lost a relationship, which was really the only serious relationship. It ended terribly.
Yeah.
I had started trying to go to AA. It was really the only resource that I had. I remember this my second stay in the psych ward, and they were about 30 days they gave me a therapist and they gave me a psychiatrist and they put me on some medications. And I'm not anti-medication, but it was pretty overwhelming. I remember my therapist saying at the time, and I read people really well. And I think that there's a big difference between reading people and judging people, but from the moment I walked in his office, I could tell he actually wanted to help me,
Yeah.
and I remember kind of being in there and him asking me questions, and I hear myself lying to him or just minimizing, and
Mm,
in the back of my head just kind of like, what are you doing? Like, this guy actually wants to help you, and I'm
mm,
resistant to actually putting anything on the table for him to work with,
yeah.
and still not really being able to do that. So and bouncing in and out of AA meetings and going to loony noonies and doing all of that. And at one point, I don't know if my parents really knew this at all. I would kind of go back to their house on occasion to kind of detox. And I remember one week I went to about 23 meetings. I'm still relapsing every 7 days or 14 days, or I could only put together about 28 days in one stretch. And I was severely depressed and suicidal. And I was at a point where I wasn't going to make an attempt because I recognized like how much pain I was going to leave my family in. So that, again, I'm kind of stuck in this, like, I can't stay sober long enough for any sort of thing to monumentally change me, and I can't stay
Mm,
drunk long enough. I run out of money, and it's miserable doing that. That doesn't give me what I need anymore either. I was bouncing between my parents' house in Walpole and this apartment in Foxborough that a good friend of mine lived in. He was in touch with a mutual friend of ours who
mm,
um, had gotten sober. And
okay.
this is a guy who was like a brother to me.
Mm,
And I eventually, before it got really bad with me, I turned my back on him. At least that's
mm,
how I saw it, because I reckon there's if we stay hanging out, like, it's going to wind up with both of us disastrously. Who
right.
knows what's going to happen? He was the guy who I never thought would ever be able to get sober. The friend I was living with, he was kind of rescuing me here and there, and I was maintaining somewhat. I was still unemployed. I was still drinking off and on here and there. And at one point, I remember being, he would drop it here and there, like, why don't you call him? You know?
Yeah.
And I was again at my parents' house and, snuck in a fifth of vodka, and I'm under my parents' porch having a cigarette in the rain, drunk. Who knows what time it was? And I call him, and he says, "Well, why don't give me? I'm up in Vermont. Why don't you give me a call in a couple days?" And we
Mm,
eventually wound up getting together, and he was back at his mom's house in Walpole, and I was pretty close with the family, and I knew his mother pretty well. And the last thing I had heard was that she threw him out and changed the locks on him, which I knew what that would take for especially her, let alone any mother, to actually
right.
do. So the fact that, like, he was welcome back there meant something.
Mm,
And it was a Tuesday, and I went over there. He said, "Okay, pick me up. We'll go to a meeting." And it was about 4 o'clock. He says, "Get on 93 North." So I'm kind of like, what do you mean? Like, there's meetings everywhere. He's like, "Well, we're
right.
we're going up to Lynn for a meeting," and I instantly thought, like, "Oh, he's got them all fooled again." Right. And
Mm,
we wound up in Lynn in some parking lot somewhere, and wound up talking to the security guard outside this building, office building, and the security guard lets us in, and there's this kind of little uh, group of drug addicts and alcoholics in what seemed to be like this warehouse
mm,
space for office equipment, and a bunch of circled chairs up, and about 12 or 13 people. And that was my first introduction to 12-step work
mm,
and the doctor's opinion. And it was nothing that I had ever really heard before. I never went to treatment. I never went to an official detox. I would wind up in the psych ward or my parents' house or my
mm,
bedroom. But it was the first time that it kind of was related to me in a way that really made sense. that it
Mm.
wasn't, and I've, come to find out later on the meeting centered around me because they knew
Right.
where I was at. I'd love to say that's when everything kind of light kind of turned on, but it wasn't. I went home and I drank that night.
Yeah.
I had a fifth of vodka waiting for me, because I didn't at that point, and I don't know if you can relate to this, but I didn't know how to do anything else other than drink.
Right.
And when the question comes, well, why do you drink? It's because I'm an alcoholic. Like
Right.
um, and I went off for another 3 or 4 months or however long it was. And come January of '06 was when I had my last drink. And I reached out again to the same friend. And he kind of plugged me into this kind of little pocket of, I guess you could call it AA, but they were really just kind of doing step work
Mm.
and in a really streamlined way, um, that made sense to me, and just kind of like, hey, this is what we do. It's here if you want it.
Yeah.
And I'm also not the guy that said like I really wanted to do it. Like I just there was something. I'd like to say there was something different about these people, which I didn't really see that at the time because at my worst, I'm an incredibly judgmental and cynical, and I'm an isolator. So I
Yep.
distance myself, regardless. It's kind of like babies instinctually will open their mouth when you come at them with a spoonful of creamed peas. Like I instinctually knew, like, this is probably the work that I'm going
Mm.
to need to do in order to get sober. And I'm also not the guy that says, 12 step is the only thing, but at that point it was the only thing that was in front of me that kind of gave me this direction.
Right.
Because even though I wasn't going to have that conversation with people, like, I was scared and I didn't know what to do, and I knew it was
Mm.
inevitable if I didn't do something that really
Yeah.
challenged how I was operating in the world, it's not going to get better, I guess. It was a slow process, but at the same time I had some really kind of monumental changes happen relatively quickly.
Hmm.
But I went in on a lie.
Yeah.
My sponsor asked me, "Are you willing to do whatever it takes?" And I'm like, I lied to him. I said yes. And
Right.
eventually that road kind of came where, okay, now it's either you're going to do it or you're not. So,
Right. From there to where you are today
yeah.
is is a huge step.
Mhm.
And in '06, what was that, 19 years ago?
I just celebrated 20 years this past January. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. Congratulations.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So what is it you do today?
So I'm a founder of Away,
Hmm.
which is a program I work primarily with men privately
Hmm.
with short 3 to 10 day reboots.
Hmm.
So I wound up in this position a couple years ago. I left and kind of went out on my own. I had been working in a residential treatment program for the last 13 years. So that's kind of where, I've done. Before I moved up to New Hampshire, I was working as a peer support for dual diagnosis program, community outreach. I was recruited 6 years sober to come work at a 12-step retreat, um, and it was a dream job, you
Hmm.
know. And so I stayed there for 13 years, and I got a lot of experience working with, there's a lot of people that come in and out through the doors of residential programs. So, um, obviously I've been kind of kicking around about doing my own thing and kind of selective, and I have, my own ideas of what's more helpful than other things. And um, I took a leap and started Away, which has kind of grown in different directions. But it's become apparent to me through uh, just a lot of the experience that's kind of come in front of me that there are a lot of people out there who are hesitant to get help. And so Away is an offering that allows people to, in a couple different scenarios, somebody who isn't committing to 60 days or 90 days or but they can take 3 days off from work and get the time off, even though they've burned some bridges there, to kind of come in and do some deep internal work. And we kind of figure out, we get on the phone with the interested guest and kind of figure out like, what have you done in the past? What has worked? What are you interested in doing? A way really focuses on slowing things down for people.
Mm,
My ideal guest is somebody who's willing to unplug from their phone and their laptop and kind of get into nature a little bit.
yeah.
I'm in New Hampshire. I'm at the foothills of the White Mountains.
Mm,
So, I just did some work with a CEO out of Boston. She came up, she'd been done a lot of work, but it kind of gotten away from it. So the work that we did together, what I'm really passionate about doing is helping people reconnect in a different way with some of the work that helped save their lives. Right. And
yeah.
I had a guy come up who was, 5 years sober, but off the rails in other ways. And okay, come on up and let's get reconnected and do some work. I'm also working with organizations as a way to help put together these training weekends that are geared towards leadership and also geared towards the newcomer entering the recovery field with a few years sober who doesn't necessarily have that experience or that weight.
Right.
Kind of, how do you navigate some of this stuff?
Mm,
Because it's really hard working in treatment. It
yeah.
is, if you are not taking care of yourself, it'll eat you up one way or another.
Mhm,
Um, and I think that there's, between the professional guy who's sitting at his desk right now, who still shows up to work and is still making things happen, but is a mess otherwise. I think it
yeah.
it works really well for that individual. I think it also works really well for companies to actually provide something that is not necessarily like a training on communication, but a training on self-care, right? And
Yeah.
how do you show up for yourself? And there have been programs where this is going to be a mandatory part of you working here, and then there
Mhm,
are other programs where employers are saying like, hey, Joe over there, I can tell, is having a hard time. He's been to treatment, but he's hesitant to he's going to lose his job if he takes another 3 months off and moves up to Portland, Maine to
yeah.
um, so I'm really proud. I'm proudest of the fact that Away as it stands right now is a truly flexible option for people. It certainly does not fit every person.
Mm,
So there are certain criterias, but I've seen a lot of guys who have shown up in treatment and kind of question like, does he really need to be here for the extended period of time? Because it is working
mm.
one-on-one with somebody is a lot different than some of the group aspect to it.
When I first got into recovery, I was seeing a counselor,
Mhm,
and we did the one-on-ones,
mhm,
and I found the one-on-ones to be so much more beneficial
mhm.
than any group thing. What are some of the things that you do at the rehab?
I just call it Away. What we're doing, when somebody lands at Away is what are the conversations we've had on the front end?
Hmm.
Does this person solid, strong recovery centers around the same thing? I'm a big believer that my number one job as a guy in recovery from now until the rest of my life is to be honest with myself.
Hmm.
So if we're looking at that as the core fundamental of, okay, how do we get there? So there's a lot of conversation.
Hmm.
There's a lot of, again, when someone has a willingness to unplug or even unplug for 90% of the day, when you're coming up, when you're leaving your home,
Hmm.
right? I do believe that online work is helpful, but I think it has more teeth when you have a relationship with the person on the other side of the internet.
Yeah.
face to face. So I think that's a big founding block that I offer people is like, okay, come up for 3 days, let's get to know each other a little bit, and
Mm,
let's slow things down. Let's get into nature, let's
mm,
get away from the phone. Let's get down to the truth of what's going on. And we do that in a variety of ways. I'm also an empowerment coach and a firewalk facilitator. We're doing a variety of exercises of, I give assignments on, we look at, if somebody's willing to, we look at the patterns of what their household looked like growing up, and the relationship with mom and maybe their
mhm,
grandparents and mom and dad, and we kind of process through little things, and we get to look at what are the things that are problematic, right? And some of that comes from sitting in a library and having conversations, and some of it comes from hitting a trail and walking through some snow, or walking across a fire, and although all those things are optional, they're not mandatory,
right.
but getting to help people gain new perspectives on things, and then from there we put together a plan, right? So the other part of this too is when someone leaves away, we're going to circle back with each other online. It's also an opportunity for, okay, I did this 4 weeks ago, but things are starting to get a little rocky with my partner.
Mhm,
Maybe I need to come back up for another day or two, and kind of, so there's that option of kind of coming back and recentering again, without this kind of detrimental thing, it becoming chaotic.
right.
So it's a lot of processing, however people want to do that. There are, using art to process things, sitting with yourself, meditation. Um, Again, and it's something that we kind of hash out on the phone or on a Zoom before somebody lands, because we don't want to just on a conveyor belt of recovery exercises, just kind of cram everything into, 72 hours, and then
Right.
nothing spills over. So I do think that there's tremendous value in helping somebody sit with themselves,
Mm,
so ultimately that's what we're doing, and accepting the truth. And a big part of this for me, and this was work I started doing 10 years sober. I think there's a big missing piece with a lot of individuals around self-forgiveness,
mm,
especially in the 12-step world, where we're out here, we're righting our wrongs, we're trying to make
yeah.
everything right. And most of us, myself included, aren't used to showing up for themselves.
Right.
I'll go to the end of the world for my kids,
Mhm,
but like, I'm going to put myself, and then I'm too exhausted to kind of help myself.
yeah.
So a lot of it is part of that too. And the gentleman who came up 5 years sober, I think that's a lot of what he experienced.
Mm.
It's like, I'm trying to like, with all the guilt and the shame of the active drug addiction and alcoholism, a lot of times we don't know or feel as if we value ourselves enough to actually take care of ourselves.
Well, Chris, I do want to thank you for
Yeah,
sharing your story, and
thanks for having me.
yeah, and sharing a little bit about what you're doing. Hopefully there's somebody out there that gives you a call, gets the help they need.
You've built the career, you've built the house, and you've built the reputation. Privately, you're exhausted, you're disconnected, and you're running on empty once again. You may not need 30 days away like you did the first time. You may only need a few days in the mountains to get yourself fully back online and fully reset once again. Away Recovery is an intensive retreat in New Hampshire's White Mountains, built specifically for high-functioning individuals who can't afford to disappear and also can't afford to keep going the way that they've been going. I know the position you're in from firsthand experience. This is the work that changes everything. Go to awayrecovery.com or call me directly at 603-892-2856.
Recover now, let your voice ring clear.